100 miles is a long way. Growing up west of Boston, we'd make a trip each summer to the southern Maine coast. I've never forgotten the time I asked when I was very young how far the drive was. My mom said it was about 100 miles, give or take. Back then, even the 2 to 2.5 hour drive seemed epic, gargantuan. Even sitting on my butt, I needed to pack snacks. I'll also never forget the time I discovered that people can run 100 miles. I remember stumbling upon a documentary about the Barkley Marathons. I think it was The Race That Eats Its Young. And as I watched, fully transfixed, it dawned on me for the first time that people don't just stop at marathons.
I can't be the only one out there who was clueless as to the existence of the sport of ultra running, and it really transformed my mental model of the capabilities of the human body and mind.
Since then, I've had a peculiar interest in the 100-mile distance. It just didn't make sense to me how so many people, and not just elite athletes, but seemingly ordinary people as well, go out there and run 100 miles, often up and down mountains, in the dark, sleep-deprived, facing the demons they encounter in the pain cave.
I had two big questions. Why and how?
Why would people subject themselves to moving almost continuously for up to and even exceeding 24 hours? Why go to such extreme lengths to experience significant pain and discomfort? And how? How do they persevere without completely falling apart? How is it that even well beyond the point of utter exhaustion, they're able to put one foot in front of the other and keep pressing on?
Searching for answers to these questions is what ultimately led me to begin exploring the limits of my own potential as a runner. But they also piqued my interest as a data scientist. In my days as an experimental psychologist, it struck me how we could find regularities in human behavior, even in seemingly unlikely places.
Despite all that makes us individually unique, when we're engaged in a well-practiced task, like reading for example, our behavior, even measured in minutiae like how long our eyes dwell on words, follows predictable patterns. Of course, there are individual differences. Some people read faster than others, some people skip over words more frequently. But we all display the same basic sensitivity to factors that makes text harder or easier to read. This can be mundane things like how clear text is displayed on a screen, but also more abstract features like how frequent a word is in the language, or if it's predictable from what came before it. Running is a well-practiced task as well, and the scientist in me wanted to know to what extent behaviors, even in rather extreme contexts like a 100-mile race, followed predictable patterns that we can measure. This, in a roundabout way, led me to where I am right now, working on data science problems for UltraSignup.
I had a deep desire to uncover the underlying behavioral parameters that collectively define ultra runners, and to tell the stories hidden behind finishing times and rankings. In today's episode of UltraData, we'll begin our deep dive into how to unpack what happens in a 100-mile race by examining the data from a sample of finishers from 2022's Javelina Jundred. Where we can, we'll cross-reference what we see in the data with the stories told by the runners themselves. And together, we'll start to uncover what led me to conclude that long trail races are the ultimate experiments in human performance. But first, I needed some data. We received a small sample of data straight from the watches of 18 100-mile runners from 2022's Javelina Jundred. For those unfamiliar with Javelina, it's an event put on each year by Our Viper Running on Halloween weekend in Fountain Hills, Arizona. It's described as the original costumed 100-mile trail party, and it looks like a lot of fun. My friend Joel ran the race last year in Crocs, dressed as the Dread Pirate Captain Croc. You just can't make this stuff up. It's a roughly 20-mile loop course with some rolling hills and tends to lean fast. The top two finishers in each gender division gain automatic qualification for Western states, so the stakes are high. The data I received spanned from finisher 1 to 166 out of 401 total finishers, and included one DNF as well. I was stoked to dig in. If you haven't cracked open the raw data from a GPS watch activity before, it consists of two primary data streams. Laps, so think every time your watch buzzes to let you know you've hit a new mile or kilometer split or a workout interval, and records. And these are samples taken at regular intervals throughout the activity. Garmin produces a developer SDK for working with the .fit files produced by various makes of watches. Coros and Apple Watches also produce .fit files, so this method does scale across different manufacturers. I wrote some wrapper functions in Python to get the data into the shape that I needed, which is a tabular structure with rows and columns suitable for matrix math. I was most interested in the records, that sample-by-sample event trail. For a Garmin Fenix 6 like I have, GPS samples are collected at 1-second intervals, so a 24-hour activity will consist of roughly 86,000 observations. Each record includes a timestamp along with lat-long coordinates, distance, altitude, speed, temperature, heart rate, cadence, power when available, and so on. Values are by default logged in metric, and yes, I did convert these values to imperial units since I'm used to thinking in terms of miles. I started with a couple of sanity checks to gauge the viability of what I had in hand. I was practically a kid in a candy store at this point, but I needed to do my due diligence and assess if what I had was legit before proceeding. I computed the final distance recorded by each watch in miles, as well as the total elapsed time, which I lined up with the official race results posted on UltraSignup. Here I was primarily looking to understand the variability in total recorded distance and variance against the official finish times. Total distance ranged from 98 to 102 miles, and at this point I did decide to exclude one data file because the watch only registered 16 miles. Now, as for the 4-mile spread in the other files, I'm sure many of you have probably had the experience of running with a partner or group on the trails and compared your tracks afterwards, only to see that your devices recorded a range of distances and elevation gain for the same course. There are two main sources of error that could contribute to this. So human error, the variability in when people press the start and stop buttons on their watches, and machine error. So remember that GPS tracking relies on communication between your watch or your phone and aerial satellites and is subject to some degree of error that accumulates over the course of the activity. And there's a ton of content out there breaking down GPS watch accuracy and the reasons why two tracks on the same course might yield different results. So I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole here, but it's a caveat worth keeping in mind. But with a few exceptions, the individual watch data was pretty close to the official finishing times. 10 out of the remaining 16 files were within 10 seconds, and the average variance was 19 seconds. After vetting my data set a bit, next I wanted to annotate the individual records data sets with mile splits. This would allow me to aggregate some basic summary statistics for each runner, like fastest, slowest, average mile split, first and second half duration, and so on. To do that, for each file, I computed the cumulative elapsed time and distance at each new record, and inserted demarcations at the record just prior to crossing the mile threshold. And side note, I did a little investigation comparing this method against Garmin's lap summary in one of my own data files, and found that Garmin cuts miles at about 13/100ths of an inch just prior to the mile mark. Now, there isn't a meaningful difference between Garmin's measure of a mile and what I did here, and at most there's 1 second variance. To gauge accuracy, I compared the split times I computed here against what Strava displayed for these runners, and it was a close match. Of course, as excited analysts do, I then created a few plots exploring high-level aspects of the data in aggregate. You might have seen this tongue-in-cheek kernel density plot appear on our Instagram page summarizing running cadence throughout the race. Running cadence is measured as the number of strides taken per minute, and the kernel density plot visualizes how frequently, on the y-axis, athletes spend time in different ranges of cadence, along the x-axis, as a smoothed curve. Almost immediately, I was struck by how visualizing cadence in this way identified behaviors in a long trail race. There's a distribution centered around 0 strides per minute, when runners are stopped, probably at an aid station, a distribution that's centered around 110 strides per minute that roughly equates to a fast walk, and then a third distribution centered around 165 strides per minute that identifies typical running behavior, as well as an additional kink in that curve around 185 strides per minute that indexes higher cadence running, like running downhill. Now, keep in mind that this data set does skew fast. 8 out of 16 data points included here from the top 10 overall. Including more mid and back of the pack runners, I would assume that the running curve would be shorter, and the first 2 curves would take on additional volume. Out of curiosity, I also made a similar kernel density plot for heart rate, which was centered around 143 beats per minute. Now, the high-level stuff is certainly interesting, but I didn't have enough coverage across race participants to make any solid claims about the race as a whole. But that's okay, since this was really just an exploratory exercise to get more familiar with running watch data and how to work with it. What I wanted to examine next was how each runner paced themselves throughout the course. More specifically, I wanted to know if pacing was consistent throughout 100 miles, or if runners consistently slowed down as they become fatigued. Now, mile splits are highly variable in a course of this length. For example, for a single runner, you might have a 30-minute split in the aid station on top of a hill, followed by a 10-minute split running down that hill, which makes visualizing trends across 100 miles a little difficult without some additional help. I used a technique common to time series analysis by computing a moving average. This effectively smooths out these spikes in the time series by averaging n observations at a time instead of representing them individually, making broader trends easier to identify. Moving averages are common in economics and epidemiology. You might have heard reference to it in 2020 or 2021 in terms of the 7-day average of weekly new COVID cases reported by the CDC and other outlets. Here, I took each runner's split pace, iteratively averaging the pace over the last n miles in a few different variations. It wasn't immediately obvious to me which granularity to use, and I tried out moving 3-mile, 5-mile, and 10-mile averages. Increasing the size of your window progressively smooths out bumps in the time series, meaning your view is less sensitive to outliers sample by sample. And there's a bit of an art to picking a window size that makes sense given the underlying data. For my purposes, I decided to stick with the 10-mile moving average because it seemed to provide a decent view of what happened lap by lap during the race. I then produced a zoomed out view of the race by creating a grid of plots where each panel ran from 0 to 100 miles on the x-axis and displayed the runner's 10-mile split pace moving average on the y-axis in minutes. I added a dotted horizontal reference line for the overall average split pace, which was 14 minutes and 55 seconds per mile as computed from the full official results, and this was just used as a bit of a visual aid. I then ordered these panels by finishing position so that the first place finisher appeared first. With this layout, the curves shift incrementally higher on the y-axis as you progress across finishing position panel by panel. Personally, I find data visualizations like this displaying behavior at a high level to be a thing of beauty, and I spent a long time poring over it and digesting it to figure out what it was telling me. And this is where things got really interesting for me. A few things jumped out at me right away. First, I noticed that each plot had about 5 little bumps that corresponded to the elevation profile of the course, in which runners would ascend about 850 feet each lap to the aid station at the top of the main climb. Though notably, many runners don't show a distinct first bump at all, perhaps because 850 feet isn't necessarily a hugely taxing climb on fresh legs, and they were able to do it relatively quickly. Second, while the top 10 finishers' pace was remarkably flat across the full course, it looked like there was a consistent, if slight, slowdown between the first and second 50 miles. Third, and quite remarkably, several runners were able to speed up in the last 10 miles coming down that final climb, even after putting 90 miles on their feet. This is a bit more obvious when you plot a linear trend line over the moving split pace. Each line ticks up and to the right from mile 0 to mile 100. Interestingly, the slope of that line tends to steepen as finishing time increases, suggesting that slower runners may experience greater impact from fatigue over time, causing them to slow down more compared to faster runners. But as in pretty much any study of human performance in a shared task, this wasn't true 100% of the time. For example, I noticed that finisher 6, while faster overall compared to finisher 7, had a steeper slowdown over time. These data points correspond to Devin Yanko and Riley Brady, the first 2 finishers competing in the women's division. Now, I should note that Nicole Bitter didn't run with a watch, so I couldn't fully represent the top 3 here. This is much easier to visualize if we pull out these 2 panels and enlarge them. What we see is that Devin's first 2 laps were very fast, averaging under 8:30 a mile, followed by increased variability and a gradual slowdown through laps 3 to 5. Compare this to Riley's plot, where we can see that they had a bit of difficulty going up the climb in lap 2, slowing down to a greater extent ascending than in lap 1. But where it gets really interesting is that while there's a consistent trend of slower splits heading into laps 3 to 5, the pace in laps 3 and 4 was in fact very similar. To dig a little deeper, I lined up the timestamps from Devin and Riley's GPS tracks to determine who was ahead of who, when, and by how much, by iteratively computing differences between their recorded distance over time. What this seemed to reveal was that Devin led by up to about 18 minutes heading into the 50-mile mark, but Riley began to catch up from then on, cutting that difference in half by the end of the race to about 9 minutes. That's pretty cool, and is a story that would never have emerged from finish times alone, but can only be reconstructed by comparing data across the time series. But how did I know it was real? I wasn't there in Fountain Hills, Arizona. I was sitting at my computer staring at numbers in Issaquah, Washington, well after the fact. If this were the Tour de France, or perhaps a large road marathon, this is the point at which I'd start reviewing video footage and attempt to piece together what happened on race day. But I didn't have access to full video footage of these runners throughout the race, and so at the time it seemed the best way of gaining that kind of qualitative data would be to ask individual runners some targeted questions. I managed to grab Riley to chat for a bit, and together we walked through some of these plots to get the scoop on race day. You might have seen other bits of our conversation in the first episode of UltraData, which focused on measuring race difficulty. Let's listen in.
So hi, Riley. It's so nice to meet you. Thanks so much for coming to chat today. How's everything going?
It's going pretty well. Thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be here. It sounds like it's going to be a pretty cool conversation.
The first time we interacted was back when I was working on some data for Javelina Jundred, which you finished second place in. Congratulations. That's like absolutely amazing. And I was hoping we could just walk through a couple of observations that I had like looking at your data because it sort of stood out to me. I remember like, I had put together like a plot of the different paces over time for all the different runners and sort of looking panel by panel, I got to Riley's panel and I was like, huh, there's something different here that Riley is doing that the other runners don't seem to be doing. And I just want to like walk through that a little bit because I think it's fascinating and I've been like geeking out about it for the past like 20 minutes again as I've refamiliarized myself with it. So do you see some plots on a screen?
Yes. Yep.
Here we have first place finisher, so Devin Yanko, and then you, Riley Brady, are right over here to the right. And this basically just lays out split pace over the course of the race, respectively. So here, x-axis, you have the mile splits, and here's pace in minutes. And now just the first thing I noticed is that so pretty much everybody in a 100-mile race slows down over time, right? Like there's this like cumulative fatigue that you get as the
Right.
miles progress, and pretty much everyone displays this pattern. But something that I noticed immediately about your data is that your trend line is a lot flatter than everybody else's. So like most people kind of display a trend like this, where there's, lap by lap, there's consistent slowdown. But actually, you don't really seem to display that. There is a slowdown, but it is to a much lesser degree. And so I'm just sort of curious, like, from a high level, if, from your perspective, as you're progressing lap by lap through the race, like how it sort of felt from your standpoint.
Oh, that's a good question. I definitely felt at the beginning like there were times I was like, we're moving like for 100 miles. This is like a pretty quick clip. Um,
Yep.
But then, by the time I got to the 5th lap, I felt like I was flying. I was like, "Man, I'm going so fast." But I think in
Yep.
reality, I was like, staying pretty close to consistent with what I had been doing earlier in the race.
Okay.
But that sort of effort level was higher. Like I mean, I was proud of myself. I was like, "I'm moving really well." But I think I felt like I was going faster than I was in actuality.
But note over here, you are going really fast there. Like in the last 10 miles of the race, yeah, you're like flying. Like that's
Oh,
amazing.
okay, that's where I did feel like I was moving, so that actually makes sense.
Okay, yeah. Okay, good. Because I'm thinking like, okay, this must be lap 5, and yeah, that's where that's happening. And a kind of another way of looking at it is in, let's see, this one here. Let me put it back in full screen. So here's kind of another way of looking at it, where here we have again mile splits here on the x-axis, and then here's two different ways of looking at it. So the blue line here is a moving average of Devin's split pace as miles progress, and yours is overlaid in orange in the same way. And down here, this basically just takes a difference between you and Devin at different points in the race. So where time is higher, it means Devin's a little bit further ahead. And I think what's really interesting to me as a first note is this. So between laps 3 and 4, you actually speed up, which is just incredible. And it almost looks like there's like a turning point for you in the race, like right around mile 50. And I'm sort of curious, like from your
perceptions, like as you're coming through lap by lap, if you sort of felt that there was a turning point, or if it really was just, consistent hammering throughout.
Yeah, I know that goal wise going into the race, I didn't really want to feel like I was racing until sometime after mile 50. Like I was
Interesting.
kind
Okay.
of, yeah. Um, and then I actually had most of my stomach issues and like my biggest challenges in the race in lap 2. Um,
Wow. Okay.
yeah. um, so I remember feeling I don't remember at mile 50 thinking like, all right, I'm putting the boots to it now and we're gonna really pick it up. Um, but I do remember thinking like, all right, after mile 50, like if I'm feeling good and wanting to push it, like I'm not gonna hold back at that point. I'm gonna try and push to the best of my abilities in the second half of the race.
Got it. Okay. And it's actually really interesting that you say that, where for many people, I feel like those kind of difficulties with stomach problems or whatever that they're having is like typically like 100K mark or maybe a little bit further than that. So it's interesting that, like, for me to think that maybe if you'd had that earlier on, it's kind of something that you can overcome and get through after that point. There's a little bit of a progression from miles 30 to 50, but after that, you're catching back up after that point. So it really is, like, to your story there, that like it became a different race after mile 50. I think that's just really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean it's 100 miles. You're out there for a long time. I feel like
Yeah.
it's hard to be like fully on it racing from the gun.
I found that to be really illuminating. To recap, Riley experienced some stomach issues in the first half of the race that were resolved heading into the second half. While I can't draw any direct causal relationships, these anecdotes do line up with what we see in the data, where we might have expected lap 4 to be paced more slowly than lap 3, but instead they were rather even. Having experienced stomach troubles myself during a race very recently, I understand the impact that has on your ability to run consistently. The men's race shook out a little differently. I did the same thing that I did with Devin and Riley, aligning and overlaying the tracks from Dakota Jones, Jon Rea, and Arlen Glick into one view, and computed the difference sample by sample between the first finisher, Dakota, against second and third place, Jon and Arlen. Here, it didn't look like Dakota sustained a lead throughout the entire race. Rather, there was some leapfrogging and positioning at various different points. For example, it appeared that Arlen Glick led for about the first 50K, with Jones surpassing him sometime after that. Additionally, Jon Rea, like Riley Brady, closed the gap significantly in lap 4 and may have come within passing distance heading into lap 5. These are exactly the kind of details that I wanted to validate, noting the caveat that I described earlier about cumulative GPS error. Jon Rea's watch in particular appeared to be missing about 5 minutes of data, given the variance that I computed between total elapsed watch time and official finish time. But it was hard to tell when exactly this happened. Given the holiday timing, I wasn't able to get everyone on the horn to chat, but I did get conversations going asynchronously over email, which helped demystify what happened on race day. I triangulated 3 sources of information to piece the story together: watch data, what they wrote on Strava after the race, and then these emails. In the first sentence Jon Rea wrote on Strava, he described one of the events that I was looking to validate.
My name is Jon Rea. I'm 30 years old, and I live in Boulder, Colorado. Golden ticket! I'm so proud of this. It's by far my best 100-miler. I caught Dakota right at the end of lap 4, but good God, he threw down an amazing last lap. I gave all I had, used all my courage to hang in there rather than just let him go, but there was no chance I could keep up with him. Second place is just fine by me today, though. I'll see you at States.
Later on, Jon writes,
Lap 1, I was with people the whole time, and lots of guys were around, more strung out than in a pack, but definitely all in close contact. Lap 3, I pretty much just saw Dakota in front of me, sometimes in sight, sometimes not. I wasn't sure who else was still up there, but I think by the end of lap 3, I was solidly in second, just behind Dakota, and with Arlen entering headquarters at the same time I was leaving it. Lap 4, I only saw Dakota in a couple spots, checked that he was 90 seconds ahead at mile 65, and at mile 70, someone told me he was 3 minutes ahead. At that point, there was still plenty of racing to do, so it wasn't time to do anything with that information yet, but I must have gradually made up time on the slightly downhill section of the loop, back half. In my mile 75, I saw him again. I could tell I was slowly catching up. I didn't want to change anything. I just kept doing my thing, but he stopped to pee behind a bush, and all of a sudden I was ahead of him. He locked in right behind me for the last half mile into headquarters, and that was a crazy moment, knowing that we were about to go out on the last lap as if it was its own 20-mile race. Dakota was quicker in the aid station, and he went out so fast that I never even saw him again after we left. I kept searching for a pair of headlamps among the runners by themselves out there, kept giving all I had on that last lap, but he never came back. Still, it was so fun to actually race 100 miles. I haven't had many ultras with that much back and forth.
Wow. That recollection is vastly more dramatic than some lines on a graph, but it does help confirm aspects of the data that I was uncertain about. I felt compelled to validate the sequence of events from Dakota's perspective as well. Dakota wrote me back with a very detailed synopsis that largely matched Jon's recollection. Dakota writes, Jon caught me right at the end of the fourth lap. I struggled really hard on that lap and was really worried about how the rest of the race would go. It was really mental. Having done 3 laps already, working really hard on a fourth one with the knowledge of a 5th lap still to come. The only times I walked during the race were on the 4th lap, when I let myself walk and eat a gel 3 or 4 times, for maybe 30 to 45 seconds each time. The last time I did that, I also took a bathroom break in a bush just before headquarters, and came back to the trail to see Jon cruising along like no problem. I tucked in behind him, and we entered the headquarters aid station together. It's really amusing to me that they both remember Dakota peeing in the bush. He continues, I kind of thought my chances at winning were over, but my style is always to just give everything I can at each moment, and there was nothing left to hold back for on that last lap. I left the aid station a bit ahead of time and expected him to catch me at any moment. I never looked back, and I just did what I could. So that does seem to form a coherent story. Jon did catch up in lap 4, surpassing Dakota after the bush, and reconvened in the aid station heading into lap 5. But Dakota was quick to the draw out of the aid station and held the lead from there on. Another detail I was looking to confirm was Arlen Glick's seeming lead for the first 50K. Dakota writes, I took a bathroom break in a bush about half a mile before the headquarters aid station on lap 1. On that lap, I suppose I passed Arlen about halfway, but it very much felt like we were all in a big group strung out over a few hundred meters. Arlen's memory was a little bit fuzzier on the exact events, but does recall spending quite a bit of time with Dakota in the first 32 miles, and believes Dakota passed him around mile 26, although they were likely no more than a minute or so apart until later on in the race. The last bit I wanted to confirm was something that really blew me away the first time I saw it. Notice in Dakota's pace plot the sharp downtick after mile 90 in the final descent of lap 5. If we zoom in and look at individual split times instead of the moving average, it's clear that many of his fastest splits in the mid 6-minute range were after mile 90. And I should note that Riley Brady had a parallel story in our conversation. I really wanted to know how Dakota engaged the afterburners after 90 miles, and so I asked directly. Dakota writes back, I was at about 11:55 elapsed and didn't think I could break 13 hours, but that didn't mean I was going to slow down. I charged down to Rattlesnake, feeling in control for the first time in hours. It was amazing, really, being able to run like that after 90 miles. I don't know how I did it. Even in the moment, I was thinking it seemed ridiculous, but I tried really hard to be present in the experience. You don't get many experiences like that. After Rattlesnake, I kept moving well, but I did not think I could break 13 until about 2.5 miles from the finish. I figured there were about 15 minutes left to the finish, and my watch was at about 12:40. So I just completely went for it. And it was a crazy feeling to realize I was able to run sub 7-minute miles after everything that day. And then I came in sight of the headquarters and saw my time and got to run it in for the course record. That was fun. It was a really good day. I feel super grateful. I will tell you now, a perceptible chill ran down my spine reading that for the first time. It's amazing to me just how conscious that decision was to kick it into high gear with the specific goal of finishing under 13 hours. The official time was 12 hours, 58 minutes, and 2 seconds. Given the limited pool of data that I was working with, I couldn't tell all the hidden stories from race day. But something that stood out to me looking at the full set of official results was just how many mini races within the race occurred throughout the pack. As an example, 7 runners finished within 2 minutes of each other between 25:44 and 25:46. And it got me thinking about how powerful it would be to overlay the tracks of similar paced runners on top of one another to better understand what they did differently and when, or overlay the results of a single runner on the same course year over year for comparison. And of course, I'm really just scratching the surface here for what's possible analyzing the data from a 100-mile race. There's so much more work to be done in this area, and we're just getting started. That said, I geeked out throughout this entire process and hope you find it insightful too. As we continue to collect data, I'll be looking to answer some of the big questions I laid out in the intro. What are the underlying parameters that distinguish the performance of individual ultra runners? And to what extent are their patterns of behavior predictable at long distances? Today, I shone some light on one hypothesis, that cumulative fatigue causes all runners to slow down over the course of a long race. But problem solving throughout, like dealing with stomach issues and goal-oriented motivation, driven either externally from competition or internally by personal goals, can influence the extent of slowdown. I hope you enjoyed the mini deep dive here. Now, some of this content was previously published in written form on UltraSignup's news page, which I'll link down to in the description. Thanks for tuning into UltraData. I'll catch you in the next one.